All right, here I am. You didn't see this, but I just had a huge catastrophe. It was actually kind of funny. But anyway, what we're going to talk about today is Lecture 52. Got a lot of stuff to go over. I'm going to try to cover it as quickly and easily and as painlessly as I can, but I will almost certainly fail at that, so I will apologize now. But anyway, let's get started. What we're going to talk about today is Lecture 52, A New Conservatism, or what your book refers to as the New Right. And what we know about we've spent a lot of time talking about the 1960s and the tremendous amount of changes and the tremendous amount of social evolution that was taking place during this time. And typically when we talk about social movements like that, these movements that are expressly intended to change something in society, we're looking at largely liberal times. So much of what we talked about had to do with political liberalism. However, the 1960s was not just a purely liberal time period. There was also a very rising and growing conservative movement that was responding to all of these new liberal ideas that were coming out at this particular time. So we're going to take a closer look at some of this stuff. So what we're going to do today is we're going to analyze the factors contributing to the rise of the New Right. Now, before we go, we'll do a real quick little review of what we're referring to with regard to liberalism and conservatism. So when I'm talking about liberalism and conservatism, of course, we're talking about these things as a political philosophy, not necessarily as a set of policies that one supports over another, because as we've covered over the span of 200 years, these ideas have shifted and changed over time. So when we're talking about liberalism, of course, we're talking about that political movement that is dedicated to social change, to changing society, presumably to increase freedom, equality, and justice within that society. And of course, we can argue as to whether or not liberalism actually does this. But this is the professed values of liberalism. On the other hand, conservatism is dedicated to social stability, to maintaining the traditional values of the society, protecting and preserving the traditional institutions of society. And of course, what we see going on in the 1960s, early 1970s is traditional institutions are being threatened largely from the outside. So, of course, these traditional institutions are going to kind of try to entrench, and they're going to defend themselves, and they're going to defend themselves quite effectively. So where do we stand by the mid-20th century, moving into the late 20th century with regard to liberalism? Well, liberalism is, of course, going to promote an active government. In essence, this is the progressive model of liberalism that's going to start to develop in the late 19th century, and into the 20th century, and reach its peak with the New Deal that we talked about in the 1930s. And this liberalism is going to advocate for such things as progressive taxation, regulation of businesses, social safety nets for people who are poor. We talked about the Great Society. And also especially during times of crisis, public works projects to keep people working and get people working. Okay, your basic New Deal, Great Society stuff is right there in liberalism. Now, on the other hand, we have conservatism, which is going to emphasize more of a small government or kind of a static government. Okay, so these are conservatism is going to advocate for things like a strong military. Okay, this is a traditional institution in the United States. We're going to have what we're going to call pro-business policies, okay? We want to, kind of reestablish those laissez-faire ideas of pro-business. And we're also looking at government as providing a moral center for people, being the moral example for people in society. And now, during this time period, of course, we see that these conservative ideas are kind of under attack. And these conservative ideas and conservative institutions are going to kind of re-entrench themselves. And they're going to re-entrench themselves in a really, really interesting and powerful movement that was coming out of this time. It wasn't powerful in the beginning. Of course, no movement really is. But it's going to be an increasingly powerful movement that's going to start taking, getting people's attention, right? And this is going to be what I'm going to call right now is Goldwater conservatism, okay? A new right idea that is going to start to develop during this time. Now, this is going to be rabidly anti-communist, all right? And anything that even remotely really resembles communism is going to be something that is going to be suspect. So think about this. Think about just how socialistic-y many of these New Deal programs are, and now we're looking at Great Society programs that Lyndon Johnson was advocating in the 1960s. Holy cow! This sounds an awful lot like state, supported economy. And that's communism. And communism, of course, leads to tyranny. And it leads to larger government structures. So the Goldwater conservatism is really going to emphasize this idea, let's shrink the government, let's get the government down in size, let's liberalize the marketplace. All right, we want to provide we want to ensure freedom of individuals within society, but that freedom is oftentimes linked to access to the market. So we want to liberalize, and by liberalize I don't want to confuse you with the liberal. What we mean is we want to open up freedom within the marketplace. And of course, we're going to advocate for states' rights. Look, kind of your strict constructionist, constitutional, kind of thing. If it's not in the Constitution for the federal government to do, the federal government simply shouldn't do it. Welfare isn't in there. Well, it actually is in there. It's in the preamble, but that's not probably what the founding fathers meant. But social safety net programs are really not in the Constitution, and therefore it should be something that the states, if the states want to do social welfare and social safety net programs, fine, let them do it, but that should be on them to do. So this kind of becomes the Goldwater thing, and of course, where's my little button? Now, of course, we're going to mix this. Now, we have these new ideas with regard to conservatism. And in essence, the Goldwater conservatives are kind of responding to what they saw as the more moderate Eisenhower kind of conservatives. A conservatism that kind of accepts certain aspects of the New Deal. Whereas the Goldwater folks are going to say, we really just have to repudiate the New Deal as much as is humanly possible and just get rid of it as much as possible because it is leading to larger governments, and larger governments are tyrannical governments. Right? And now we also have to take a look at what was going on during this time period. So we have this growing Goldwater conservatism, a new form of conservatism that's developing in the United States, and it's kind of competing with the New Left, right? And competing with these new liberal ideas that are coming out of the 60s, where we're actually going to go, all right, we have this New Deal liberalism now, but we want to take it just a little bit further and push some of these moral boundaries and push some of these traditional boundaries a little bit more. But now, so as we come into 1964, 65, these new left ideas are pretty much the dominant political ideas at the time. But as we're moving into 1967, 68, well, let's take a look at 1968. Holy cow, what a tumultuous year this is. We're going to start 1968 off with the Tet Offensive. Of course, we talked about Vietnam in the last lecture, and as far as people knew up until 1968, the president was pretty hush about the things that were going on in Vietnam, but the things that he did tell people that were going on in Vietnam was pretty much good news. We're winning. We just got to hold out a little bit longer. We will eventually be successful. Don't worry about it. Well, in January of 1968, the Viet Cong are going to launch their largest offensive. It is a huge-scale offensive called the Tet Offensive, and it is really going to wake Americans up as to the fact that things were not necessarily going the way the government was telling us it's going, in that time. So we have the Tet Offensive, and people starting to question the validity of the Vietnam War at this stage of the time. Also, too, in April of 1968, the great civil rights leader Martin Luther King is going to be assassinated. Now, 1968 was also an election year. Right, so and the Democratic Party, typically the Democratic Party is in charge, right? Lyndon Johnson's the president. He's the Democrat, and he is the sitting president. He is able to run for re-election. So in 1968, it should come as no surprise that Lyndon Johnson is going to run for re-election. However, the response to Vietnam, to the revelations of what was going on in Vietnam, and to the Tet Offensive, by the middle of 1968, it was very clear to Lyndon Johnson that he wasn't going to actually be the nominee. He wasn't going to win the nomination. He was actually going to be primaried by folks within the Democratic Party, namely Eugene McCarthy and possibly Robert Kennedy. And he's figuring, you know what? My poll numbers are going down. I'm probably not going to win. So Lyndon Johnson actually backs out. He said, he comes up. He says, "Hey guys, look, I'm going to work on creating peace in Vietnam, but I'm not going to run. I'm not going to seek the nomination of president in 1968." And of course, this throws the Democratic primaries wide open, right? And a couple of real powerful figures start to come out of this. For instance, Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy, both of whom were kind of representing the new left, although Eugene McCarthy was probably a lot more new lefty than was Robert Kennedy was, who had some of these ties to the Cold War, to the kind of Cold War liberalism that had developed under his brother John Kennedy. So Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy are kind of slugging it out in the primaries, trying to win primary elections. Of course, the third candidate here is a fellow by the name of Hubert Humphrey. He was a little bit more boring, less interesting, and certainly kind of the old school Democratic liberal. That was running at this stage of the game, and he's actually kind of playing the back scenes. He's playing the delegates game. He's really not competing too much in the primaries. He's going to let McCarthy and Kennedy kind of slug it out as much as he can, and hope for kind of winning some delegates over in the primaries. Well, of course, in 1968, we also see the assassination of Robert Kennedy. So Robert Kennedy's in California. He wins the California primary. He's like, "Hey, this is great news, guys. We're going to go on. We're going to win the election." And as he was leaving the California primary, a guy by the name of Sirhan shoots him and kills him. So now we see Martin Luther King, assassinated. Kind of the heir, the political candidate who was kind of speaking to the civil rights crowd was Robert Kennedy, and bam, he's assassinated, leaving Eugene McCarthy and Hubert Humphrey to kind of fight it out. And Eugene McCarthy was largely speaking to a youth audience. He had what was called the Children's Crusade. Well, they weren't exactly children, but they were young people who were kind of stomping for Eugene McCarthy. And then in 1968, they held their convention in which they're going to announce who the nominee for president is, and the convention was an absolute cluster. You had protesters out in front of the convention in Chicago, and you had all kinds of arguments going on inside the convention. You have Eugene McCarthy's young people wearing black armbands, protesting the stance of the Democratic Party with regard to the Vietnam War. You've got folk singers leading the McCarthyites through the convention, singing "We Shall Overcome." I mean, you can't even make this stuff up. And then outside, you had Mayor Daley of Chicago tell the police hey, it's time to end this protest, and the police therefore ended up turning the protest into a riot. So now we have riots in the streets taking place outside of the 1968 Democratic National Convention. It was an absolute mess. In the meantime, we have some other problems that are going on. Foremost on people's minds was the urban crises. The cities were starting to take very, very serious economic hits with their middle-class tax bases moving out into the suburbs and being replaced largely by poor and mostly minority people moving into the cities. And this is not only creating pockets of poverty, we also talked about redlining and things along those lines. So these cities weren't even able to get loans and stuff to try to rebuild and restructure their infrastructure. But now we're also looking at race issues, of course, that are going to come to a head, especially with the assassination of Martin Luther King. So we end up seeing race riots taking place in the cities like Watts, Los Angeles, Detroit. And during this time, we are also seeing rising crime rates, rising use of drugs. So my God, so if we take a look at society during the late 1960s, we're talking about a very, very unstable time. And when things start to get unstable, people start looking around for stability. And what is the political ideology of stability? Well, it's conservatism. And the claim, of course, is that, look, we've gone too far. These changes have gone too far. We've destabilized our society. We've got to get back to reestablishing law and order. We have a new leadership developing in the among conservatives. Namely, of course, we have going all the way back to the 1950s. William F. Buckley was a leading conservative intellectual of his time. The founder of the magazine National Review, still around. He, for almost 30 years, was the host of a political debate show on PBS. So he was a major shaper of conservatism. We talked about Barry Goldwater and his contributions. Of course, we're going to talk about him a little bit more in just a second. We also have to take a look at economist Milton Friedman. Now, Milton Friedman was an economist, but he's going to come up with some different ways of thinking. He is going to refute the Keynesian position of government intervention in the marketplace when things are going badly. Of course, Keynesianism is the idea of priming the pump of the economy in order to keep the economy going. Milton Friedman's going to say, hey, look, what you're doing here, all the government is doing when it intervenes in the economy is it's actually crowding out legitimate investors. And that what is ultimately going to happen is if the government keeps getting involved in the economy, you're going to end up with a stagnating economy. Ultimately, the economy is just going to slow down, shut down, and it's not going to work very well. So Milton Friedman and his guys from the Chicago School of Economics are going to come up and say, hey, look, the best way to run an economy is to just not run the economy. Let's just let people be free in this economy, let businesses do whatever it is that they need to do to run the economy, and you will have a strong economy just kind of chugging along. Now, at first, that's a tough claim to make in the 1950s and 1960s because what you have really is a New Deal economy with relatively high taxes, with government regulations, and the government is very much involved in the economy. And here's Milton Friedman saying, no, you can't do that. We've got to get away from this. We've got to repudiate the New Deal. Of course, the Goldwater people are going to lash on to Milton Friedman's economic policies and ideas. So we're going to talk a lot about some elections during this lecture. And what I want to do here is I want to kind of compare a couple of elections going on here. The first one is the election of 1964. Now, in 1964, Johnson has got his Civil Rights Act, and just as Richard Russell had predicted, he's going to lose the South, and he's largely going to lose the South pretty big. In fact, 1964 election, the heart of the South, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and also in this case South Carolina, is actually going to flip. These were solidly Democratic voting states, but because of the Civil Rights Act and because of desegregation, these states are going to flip to Republican, to Barry Goldwater, who's saying that, hey, look, civil rights should be a states issue, and let the states decide how to deal with this stuff. They're going to flip. They're going to like him. They're going to go with Barry Goldwater, and now we're going to start to see, wait a minute, the political alliances that we were able to take for granted, the New Deal coalition, that coalition between northern liberal Democrats and the more conservative traditionalist Southern Democrats that was put together by Franklin Roosevelt is not going to hold through the 60s. So we're taking a look at this, but the reality is, except for the Solid South and for Barry Goldwater's home state of Arizona, Goldwater's pretty much going to have it handed to him. I mean, he is just going to be smashed by Johnson in the election in 1964. But as popular as Johnson was in 1964, by 1968 he was not popular at all, largely because of the Vietnam War and what was called the credibility gap. The people had lost faith in Johnson's ability to lead, largely as a result of Vietnam. So now we're going to take a look at the 1968 election, in which Hubert Humphrey gets the nomination in the just absolute mess that was the 1968 convention, mostly because he played the delegates, and went up against veteran politician Richard Milhous Nixon. Now, Richard Nixon is going to institute something that he refers to as the Southern Strategy. Look, 1964, holy cow, look, these Southern states went Republican. The solid South is done, right? The solid Democratic South is done. They're joining the party of Lincoln. So we need to. So according to Nixon, we need to play to that, and he started to play to the dissatisfaction of white Southerners in the South who were against the Civil Rights Act, and this was what was referred to as the Southern strategy. It doesn't work too well for him. Well, it actually works fairly well for him. A number of Southern Democratic states actually flip and turn to the Republican. They vote for Nixon, who is running on a platform of law and order. Let's reestablish law and order. We've got to do something about these rising crime rates. We've got to do something about rising drug use, and we've got to do something about the rioting in the streets. So he's running on this law and order, but in the South, he's running on white disaffection. Now, the Solid South actually didn't like Nixon all that much. And they went for an independent candidate, a guy by the name of George Wallace. So in 1968, even though Nixon didn't pick up the votes of the Solid South in 1968, neither did the Democrat, neither did Hubert Humphrey. Right. So this went to George Wallace. Wallace's goal, of course, was to screw up the election so that neither candidate could get a majority, and then his hope was to win the election in the House of Representatives. It didn't work out for him. Nixon got a clear majority in 1968, even though it was pretty much of a squeaker of an election. So what we're seeing here, of course, is this switch, is this flip from the solidly Democratic South to a more Republican and more, and I don't necessarily know about more conservative, but certainly a more Republican South. Now we're going to briefly go over Richard Nixon. Now Richard Nixon, of course, running on some solid conservative credentials. But remember, it is still the 60s, and there's still a lot of liberal movement going on during this time period. So some of his social policies, and ultimately even his economic policies, weren't necessarily as conservative as many conservatives would have liked them to have been. For instance, one of the things that Nixon is going to recommend is something called the FAP. My mind is locked up here. Hold on, give me a second here. So the Family Assistance Plan. Boy, sometimes it's hard to do in these video lectures. So the Family Assistance Plan, and this is an interesting plan. The idea of the Family Assistance Plan is to provide a mandatory minimum income for all poor people. I think it was like $1,600. So that if you're poor, you're going to get a check of $1,600. You have a mandatory minimum annual income of $1,600. Well, that wasn't particularly much, and a lot of conservatives were saying, "Hey, wait a minute, what are you doing? A mandatory minimum income? That's not a conservative principle." Stay out of that. And then the liberals were saying, "What do you mean $1,600? Are you kidding me? That's not enough." We have a good thing kind of going with this Great Society stuff. Well, Nixon, of course, kind of gets spanked on this. He does not win the FAP. He does offer what he calls a new federalism. Look, and say kind of a little a gift to the Goldwater guys and saying, "Hey, look." Instead of the federal government providing for these social safety nets and welfare services and things along those lines, well, let's just give block grants to the states and let the states deal with it. Let the states handle how they want to handle these social safety nets instead of the federal government. Get the federal government out of it. So it's kind of a bit of a cop to the more conservative Goldwater types. Now, the environment was an area where the Nixon campaign was squarely kind of on that liberal-y side, right? He started the Environmental Protection Agency. He pushed for and ultimately signed the Clean Air Act, the Water Pollution Control Act, or the Clean Water Act. These things were Nixon supported, Nixon signed, and they are still the law today. Foreign policy is another area where Richard Nixon had some tremendous impact. For instance, he started a policy called détente. In other words, look, we almost blew ourselves to smithereens, not too long ago. Why don't we cool off a little bit? So he goes to Moscow and he negotiates with Leonid Brezhnev in Russia, and they decide to just kind of chill out a little bit, where they're going to relax their stance toward each other for the most part. And ultimately, the Soviet Union and the United States will sign what was called the SALT I Treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which limited the number of anti-ballistic missiles. Those are missiles that are designed to shoot down other missiles, and ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, the ones that we're going to launch at each other from far away that can cover the Earth in about a half an hour. We're going to limit the number of these that we produce. Unfortunately, SALT I does not actually say that it may limit the number of ICBMs, the number of rockets we put up, but not the number of warheads you can put on those rockets. So sometimes we fudge this by by simply putting like a whole bunch of warheads on one rocket that split off once we get into space and shoot multiple. There's always a way around things. But probably his biggest contribution to foreign policy was with China. It was referred to as ping pong diplomacy. What had happened was China had kind of opened up. Nixon actually opened up these back channels with China, with Mao Zedong in China, and Mao Zedong invites an American delegation over to play ping pong with the Chinese ping pong players, and this kind of became the nexus of opening up relations. So Nixon actually goes to China and starts the process of normalizing relations with China. We already talked about Vietnam, and one of the lessons that Nixon's going to learn about Vietnam is that, hey, look, maybe putting boots on the ground is not the best idea. Maybe if we want to fight communism, we need to do it through proxy wars, and we need to do it by supporting anti-communist leaders. Unfortunately, many of these anti-communist leaders were brutal dictators. So, for instance, in Chile in 1971, Chile elected a Marxist government under the leadership of Salvador Allende, and Nixon, through his secretary, his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, and the CIA helped to get Salvador Allende overthrown. During the coup, it was announced that Allende had committed suicide. An American-backed leader was installed by the name of Pinochet, who was a brutal dictator and was not a good guy. But he was not a communist, so he was, he does the trick. Now, unfortunately for everybody, really, but unfortunately for Nixon too, the economy during this time was starting to slow down. So the huge expansion that we had experienced in the 1950s and 1960s is starting to slow down in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and it is an absolute mess. It is, we've talked about before with the Federal Reserve, when for instance, if unemployment starts to increase, the Federal Reserve simply lowers its rates, and then that stimulates investment, and that means more people get hired, and that means the unemployment rate goes down. If the unemployment rate goes down too far, then inflation happens, and the inflation rate rises, and then the Federal Reserve raises its rates, and that brings down inflation. And the Federal Reserve's job is to maintain this balance between employment and inflation. And let's face it, during the 1950s and 60s, the Fed did a fairly decent job of doing this. But in the 1970s, we ended up with a problem, a huge, huge problem that the Fed wasn't quite able to get its handle on. On the one hand, we had rising inflation. On the other hand, we had rising unemployment. Now what do we do? They say, all right, well, we have some problems going on now, and the Federal Reserve was not set to handle it, and let's face it, Nixon was not particularly interested in economics. So what were the causes of this mess that we had going on here? And the reality is that these causes are, for the most part, still under debate. The bottom line is, the United States did experience, toward the end of the 1960s, declining productivity. Why? We don't really know is the problem. It suggested that maybe increasing numbers of women and young people going into the workforce were taking low-skilled jobs, so therefore a higher proportion of the jobs were low-skilled jobs and not necessarily productive jobs. Maybe some people blame the unions for creating these secure union jobs, and therefore there was no incentive for people to work. That doesn't seem to really. We're really not entirely sure what is causing this drop in productivity. But one thing I could suggest maybe is that maybe some of the instability that was going on in society, especially instability that was going on in the cities, which had historically been a centerpiece of the American economy for quite a few decades now, was probably, or may have been, and I'm just kind of speculating here, may have kind of made people a little iffy about investing their money. Whatever the cause is, there may be multiple causes, the United States was declining in productivity during this time period. Also, another problem that we had was Johnson's policies. Johnson had instituted this Great Society program, and welfare programs tend to raise inflation. which can usually be counterbalanced by raising taxes, but he also was fighting a war, and wars also tend to be inflationary, unless you also raise taxes. Well, but Johnson didn't actually raise taxes. So consequently, we have this growing inflation that's going to take place in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and this is going to be a huge problem. We also, another thing that's adding to inflation was the conflicts that we were having with OPEC, the oil-producing and exporting countries. This is really a problem. Organization of Petroleum Exporting Company. I'm sorry. But either way, this is going to be a real problem, because if you think about it, what they did is they put an embargo on us. They limited the amount of oil that they were going to sell, or stopped the amount of oil that they were going to sell, creating an oil shortage, which of course raises the value of gasoline. But if you think about this, think about all of the things in a market that depend on gasoline. Right? So that means if you raise the value of gasoline, then the value of everything else is going to go up as well. So this oil crisis is going to take a huge toll on us. And another problem is during the 1950s and much of the 1960s, the U.S. industries didn't have any foreign competition. American-produced products, if you wanted a car, it was going to be an American car. But toward so the United States and American businessmen had very little incentive to invest in advancing their evolving their production, right? They didn't have to invest in greater efficiency and things along those lines because they had a virtual monopoly, an international monopoly on these products. So there wasn't much incentive. And also the claim is made by Friedmanites, and that increased government regulations also increase the cost of doing business. And therefore that limited the amount of incentive that businesses have to invest in expanding their businesses, because that only means they're going to have to spend more on regulations. So all of these things probably played some kind of a factor in this. So consequently, the fourth thing is that the United States started to lose its competitive edge. But pretty soon, they started facing competition from countries like Germany and Japan that were starting to put out industrial products. Now, Richard Nixon tried to deal with this in a couple of ways. One, he tried to put price controls and wage controls in place. That didn't work worth a darn. And also another thing that he did is he realizes that the United States was starting to fall further into debt with other countries. Not necessarily borrowing debt, but a trade deficit. In other words, we were starting to import more goods than we were exporting. And this is a problem because in 1945 the United States had agreed that they would pay back dollars in gold. Well, because of exporting, foreign countries held more dollars than they ever had before. Right? So consequently, they were able to exchange that for gold, and there was simply just not enough gold to exchange those dollars for. So Nixon was kind of forced, although we can argue as to how much he was forced. But Nixon eventually says, "Look, we're not going to trade dollars for gold anymore," and he takes the United States off of the gold standard, which means that the dollar is now devalued. Which, of course, when you're having an inflationary problem, the dollar being devalued might be a bit of a problem, and now, of course, the dollar is able to float freely based on demand for the dollar in the global market, and it remains that way. We've never gone back on the gold standard, although some would suggest that we should. So some of the consequences for this, well, the economy is just going to stagnate. Productivity is going to remain low. So the productivity gains that we made between 1950 and 1960 almost virtually disappeared in the 1970s, right? It took us a decade to achieve in the 70s the kind of economic growth that we had in 1 year in the 1950s and 1960s. So this is a huge problem. And of course, if productivity stagnates, then wages are going to stagnate. People are not going to make as much money. It's also going to now, during this time period, we saw more women coming into the marketplace, but as a result of stagnation, and in the face of inflation, that meant that people are going to have to find ways of making more money in order to make ends meet, and one of the ways of doing that is to have mom go into the workforce. So larger numbers of women are going to enter into the workforce, and of course that decreases the value of labor, which further degrades wages. And we also see that this is a time period where unions are really, union power had already started to dip by the late 1960s, but by the 1970s the power of unions and the number of union members is going to start to sink very, very rapidly. Why did I put this first? I don't want this first. Anyway, alright, I don't know what I did here. I thought I had the 1972 election. Look, the bottom line is, despite the economy, in 1972, Richard Nixon wins by a landslide. It's one of the biggest margins of victory in American history. It may have been actually the largest margin of victory in American history, but that popularity is going to be short-lived because of revelations of the Watergate scandal. It turns out that that one of the things that Richard Nixon did to try to win, or at least his campaign did to try to win the election, was to do some dirty tricks. In other words, he had, or his campaign had, folks go into the Democratic campaign headquarters in the Watergate building and steal plans and put surveillance equipment in, and unfortunately they were caught. Now they tried to say that they weren't affiliated with the campaign at all, but they were. And when the Nixon crew, when Nixon and his folks got word of this, that these guys had been caught, they did everything that they could to cover it up. They didn't cover it up enough. Word got out. It broke to the press. And when it broke to the press, there were congressional investigations and hearings. And of course, with enough force and enough structure, they eventually were able to say, hey, wait a minute. All these conversations were recorded in the White House. You got tapes of all of these conversations that you guys are having. We want those tapes to see if you really did cover it up. Well, he really did cover it up, and it was on tape, and there was no way Nixon was going to give these tapes to anybody. And he refused to give them. And eventually the Supreme Court even said, you got to give up the tapes, my friend. And at that point, articles of impeachment were put into effect in the House of Representatives. But before the actual impeachment trial, Richard Nixon resigns from office. So be real careful with this. Richard Nixon was not actually impeached. There was not an impeachment process. The impeachment process had started, but there was not an actual impeachment. He did not leave office because he was impeached, and the Senate said you can no longer be in office. He resigned. So he is not one of the presidents who was impeached, if you were to see that question on a test. This is, of course, now his vice president, Gerald Ford, is going to take over. But Gerald Ford is not going to win the 1976 election. The election is actually going to go to a fellow by the name of Jimmy Carter. Now, wait a minute. Look here. Look, if you notice here, well, it looks like the South is blue again. Hey, the solid South is back, right? No. Jimmy Carter himself was Southern. He was a Southern Democratic governor of Georgia, and that is probably what convinced a lot of Southern folks to vote for him. He was somewhat liberal, but not nearly as liberal as many of his contemporaries in the Democratic Party. Although he was a very firm advocate for civil rights. Of course, the first thing that Carter's got to try to figure out is how to deal with the economy, and he's trying everything, right? He tries tax cuts. Well, that doesn't work because tax cuts are inflationary. Well, he tries public works. Well, public works, we don't really want to spend that much money on public works, and public works are inflationary. He tries to get the Federal Reserve to use expansionary policies. Well, that's great for the stagnant economy, but expansionary policies are inflationary. Finally, it comes as no surprise that with all of these policies in place, inflation increases, and that makes life a lot more difficult for a lot of people. A little bit of inflation is okay for folks, but a lot of inflation makes life very, very difficult for Americans, and life became very, very difficult for Americans. He then tries to say, all right, well, maybe we need to start listening to this Milton Friedman guy. He starts the process of deregulating businesses to try to stimulate investment, but that's really not working either. He tries, he kind of pulls back on some of these public investments. And finally he gets up and he says, hey guys, look, we're just going to have to cut back and have lower expectations. He gives what became known as the malaise speech. Probably one of the worst speeches a president has ever given. Much of what he said was actually, kind of defensible. unfortunately, you can't tell people, you know what, it is what it is, you're just going to have to deal with it. Cut back on stuff. That's not what people want to hear. They want to hear a more positive message, and they're going to hear a more positive message, but not from President Carter. There was also the energy crisis. There was another embargo put into place. Well, why don't we just use nuclear power? Well, because we almost blew up a nuclear power plant and caused a whole problem with the 3 Mile Island nuclear reactor leak. Now, Carter is going to, in fact, have some pretty significant successes in foreign policy. He will convince Israel and Egypt to sign a peace treaty, which was a huge deal. And this peace treaty still stands today. It was called the Camp David Accords. He negotiates a peaceful turnover of the Panama Canal to Panama, which was pretty impressive. He formalizes ties with China, so he kind of builds on Richard Nixon's foreign policy successes. And he also kind of is involved in pulling off a bit of a coup in Afghanistan, in which the government of Afghanistan had thrown off its government and established its own Marxist dictatorship. Not dictatorship, but its own Marxist government. Carter and his National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, kind of go in there and motivate an overthrow of that leader. And in the process, the Soviet Union gets involved in Afghanistan to try to support their guy. And this is going to get the Soviet Union in its own little political quagmire, kind of its own version of Vietnam, if you will. So this is a huge problem for us in the future. But Carter's biggest problem was in Iran. In Iran, there was a revolution against the Pahlavi government. The Pahlavi government was our guy associated with American interests. He was overthrown. He actually leaves the country to seek medical treatment in the United States. The Iranian people wanted Carter to turn him over. Carter said no, and they ended up taking a bunch of American hostages in the U.S. Embassy. It's 66 of them or so, and they held those hostages. Now, Carter was trying to negotiate their release, but was never able to actually do it. And at one point he tries a rescue mission, but the rescue mission failed spectacularly. So consequently, he is going to be in trouble moving into the 1980 election. High inflation, the economy's still not doing well. Yes, some jobs have been created, but for the most part, people are having a very negative impression of Jimmy Carter at this stage of the game. So to kind of wrap this up, I want to go through this relatively quickly. So we see some political shifts taking place in the 1970s, right? We fractured the New Deal coalition. The civil rights program of Lyndon Johnson and other other Democrats is going to just fracture the New Deal coalition. And it's going to allow for Nixon's Southern strategy and also President Reagan, well, not President Reagan, but Ronald Reagan, who was governor of California at that time, is also going to start to play against white resentments for the welfare programs that were put into place. Discussed with government. Look, it sure seems like government really is a problem, right? Watergate, Vietnam, Nixon being exonerated by Gerald Ford. This is a scam. Right? So we have some real problems with this. This is going to open things up for statements like government isn't the solution, government is the problem, which is probably Ronald Reagan's most pressing claim. Economic stagnation. It sure looked like this Milton Friedman guy is right. Stagnation, inflation, high unemployment. Maybe we do need to return to some of these free market ideas and these laissez-faire policies that we haven't really been practicing since the 1920s. And also Jimmy Carter's fumbles, his malaise speech, the Iran hostage crisis is going to leave Americans looking for a much more positive message. And it's a message that they're actually going to get in the form of the California Governor Ronald Reagan. Now, Ronald Reagan is going to run for office, and he is going to have the benefit of what becomes known as the Conservative Coalition, or the New Right Coalition. And this New Right Coalition is going to pretty much be composed of those people who were disaffected by the reforms of the 1960s. Orthodox Christians who were seeing a breakdown of moral values that were taking place with the new left, counterculture kind of hippies of the 1960s. White Southerners, of course, and their resentment towards civil rights and desegregation. Alienated Democrats, people who were feeling that the Democratic Party had swung too far to the left. Business leaders who were resentful of taxes, relatively high taxes, and regulations that were being put on them. A destabilized middle class. The middle class was no longer a growing body. The middle class was now kind of feeling threatened, feeling like they were on the wire a bit. And also the infrastructure that was built by conservative intellectuals like William F. Buckley and others. Think about all those young men who were working for the Goldwater campaign, Pat Robertson, for instance. These guys were now seasoned politicians moving into the late 1970s. So we've got this great coalition going on. It's a very, very powerful coalition, and ultimately it is going to lead to, in 1980, a complete shift in our government, in our way of doing government, in the form of President Ronald Reagan, who is going to just completely trash, sitting President Jimmy Carter in the 1980 election. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about Ronald Reagan later on, and probably in the next lecture or so, and I would talk about and go a little bit further into depth about Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and moving into some of the policies that are going to lead us into the 21st century. In the meantime, take a breath. It's over. See ya.